We're almost at capacity in this room. So I just want to remind people that if there aren't enough spaces, there's an overflow room upstairs in L201. So you just take the stairs up one flight. We seem to be okay now, but just so you know that there's space if we fill up here. So I'm happy to introduce our second panel, which is Healthcare Data Privacy and the Surveillance State, which will be moderated by Asha Shelso, who is the Director of the Health Law and Policy Program at AU Washington College of Law. She teaches a variety of experiential courses on the topics of healthcare, fraud and abuse, corporate compliance, governance, digital health, and healthcare business transactions. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Sonia, and good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this just terrific panel today. And boy, do I feel energized and warmed up by the morning session. That was terrific. We're going to build up that energy. We might start with some dire thoughts, but we're going to end on a positive note. So bear with us as we navigate that. And again, we absolutely welcome questions. So please start to keep some of those in mind. Sonia, thank you for that introduction. As Sonia mentioned, my name is Asha. And let me just take a moment to introduce our just terrific panelists here. It's going to be short introductions because we're going to get to know and learn a lot about their expertise through their comments. I also just want to briefly thank our Con student fellow, Tom Romanchek, for helping us organize this panel today. Thank you, and for all the students. Yeah. So, and I'm going, I think, in order here to my left. We have Bethany Corbin, thank you for being here, who's a healthcare innovation and femtech attorney dedicated to helping founders revolutionize women's healthcare. She is a recognized thought leader at the intersection of women's health and technology and is in the process of establishing a femtech 501c3 organization to enhance women's health education. Caitlin Gertz, Dr. Gertz is an epidemiologist and the vice president for research at IBIS Reproductive Health. Her research has included clinical and epidemiologic studies on self-managed abortion, access to abortion in restrictive legal contexts, and digital technologies to support abortion access. And then we have Laura Lindberg. Dr. Lindberg is professor at the Rutgers School of Public Health, where she directs the program in sexual and reproductive health. As a demographer, she focuses on improving measurement of sexual and reproductive health and has been funded by the National Institutes of Health to conduct research aimed at improving the measurement of abortion in U.S. surveys. Anya Prince is a professor at the University of Iowa College of Law. Her teaching and research interests explore health and genetic privacy with a particular focus on the implications of big data. And Kate Weisberg. Kate is joining us over there on the other end, is an associate professor of law at the George Washington University School of Law. Her primary interests are in the areas of criminal investigation, adjudication, post-conviction law, and civil rights. You can see right away the interdisciplinary nature of our panel today, and we're really going to do our best to really bring all those different perspectives together. Okay, whew, got the bios done. That was the hardest part. All right. Okay. So I'm actually going to ask Bethany to kick us off, and let me explain that for a moment first. So in earlier sessions, of course, yesterday, even just this morning, we've had so many thought-provoking discussions about the significant implications of Dobbs, but we've seen some themes. I'm going to highlight just a few that are rising: the fear, the inequities, the disproportionate impact, the ramifications for crucial research and data collection. So these are just a few of the themes that we are going to look at today from the lens of data privacy and surveillance. So I've asked Bethany, because we have a really wonderfully diverse audience, both here in the room as well as nationally online, to give us a little bit of that level setting, build a foundation for us to help us bring these perspectives together. Not only understanding foundationally where we were in June when Dobbs was first published, but also decided, where it sort of evolved over 8 months, right? Because I think part of the timing of this conference was intentional. The idea to sort of say, let's see how this has evolved and what this means now for data privacy, and again, how it's going to continue to evolve. So Bethany, if you'll kick us off from there, and then we'd like to delve into a lot more nuances after that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and having me on this panel. Asha, thank you for the great introduction. I want to start first, as Asha mentioned, just by level setting on what we're talking about when we're thinking about data privacy and all of the different considerations that fall into that bucket. So before the Dobbs decision, privacy was obviously a concern for women, especially when we're talking about reproductive health care, but not to the same extent that it is now because of the potential that data could be used against these women when they're having abortions or when they're even seeking fertility care or other types of care from an OBGYN or a healthcare provider. So before Dobbs, we had a structure, and we still have the structure today, but for those who aren't as familiar, we have the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And what HIPAA does is HIPAA, interestingly enough, right, HIPAA itself was not related to privacy, but we have the HIPAA privacy and security rules, and those are really governing your interactions as a patient with your healthcare providers who are billing insurance and other types, covered entities is what we call them. For the practical purposes, right, it's really you as a woman between you and your healthcare provider. We have seen since 2016 an emergence of what we call femtech, meaning female health technology applications. Those are things like your period tracking apps, right? Your fertility tracking apps, all of those types of things that have really started to blossom and grow in size, and the entire industry really is several $billion now. And that's really started to take off around 2021. And we've seen that continue to grow, especially during the COVID era. What a lot of people don't know is that HIPAA does not necessarily apply to the data that's being stored in those types of femtech applications. There's a huge misconception, especially among patients, that the data that you're giving to your application is going to be protected the same way that HIPAA protects your data that you give to your healthcare provider. And that's been the misconception that has existed before Dobbs. And it's not really been as big of a concern. This is true even outside of the femtech context when we're thinking about things like mental health applications. Since Dobbs, what we've started to see is patients, and women in particular, being more and more conscious and concerned about how their data is being used in these applications. We're starting to see, as Asha mentioned, that theme of fear arising because now there's the potential that law enforcement could get their hands on this data and could use that data to either prosecute a provider who has provided that abortion, or, depending on how these laws start to evolve, the woman herself if she has an abortion. So since the Dobbs decision, we've seen a flurry, and I'm sure that you've read in the news as well, of women wondering whether or not they should delete their period tracking apps and their femtech apps because of these data privacy concerns. As a privacy attorney, I can tell you, I work with a lot of femtech startup companies and startup companies in the healthcare space. A lot of those founders are not taking privacy into consideration in designing their products with privacy-centric technology in place. That's starting to change now. I've started to see investors demand privacy with a capital P when they're thinking about where to put their money. But at the same time, this is something that entire femtech industry is really having to grapple with right now and try to decide, okay, how do we now, on the back end, implement these privacy-enhancing solutions? We've started to see, for instance, Flow came out and said that it had an anonymous app. What does that mean? What does anonymous really mean? Can they still link that data back to your prior application that had your actual name, right, location, all of that? We've also started to see enhanced scrutiny on data brokers, especially when we think about how these applications are selling your data downstream. It's become more apparent, right, that law enforcement can actually use these data brokers as a way to get data that they would otherwise need a subpoena or other lawful court order to obtain. So there's been sort of a shift since the Dobbs decision away from these femtech apps. And that's what we're starting to see. Women are very concerned with how their data is going to be used. They're starting to look more into what HIPAA actually protects. Is that data protected? And I'm starting to get a lot of questions from that industry about how do we make this work? How do we protect women's health and drive women's health innovation in a landscape where privacy is of utmost concern?
Thank you, Bethany, for laying that foundation. We're going to unpack all of that. That's what we're going to spend our time doing today. So thank you for that. So prior to the Dobbs decision, we all know generally that there was focus on consumer protection and protection of data in particular here, but there was always this sort of resistance to pinpointing the harm. And courts struggle with this, and of course, big tech really pushed that agenda of sort of saying, well, what's really the harm here? Dobbs has completely transformed that conversation. We also understand that we want to grapple with this question of that privacy and data protection are not actually the same thing. We tend to conflate these concepts. So we'll explore that a little bit as well. We also know in many of our conversations just even yesterday that history of women being prosecuted for their reproductive choices. So with that quick backdrop and Bethany's foundation, let's look at some of these apps. Let's look at some of these specific sort of trigger points that we all read about, day one after the Dobbs decision about, oh, delete your period tracking apps or watch what you say to your provider. Don't take pregnancy tests. Don't use a fertility app. Delete your search history or be really fearful of what you might be searching for on the internet. So let's unpack that, right? If you'll start with that, Caitlin, just to kind of help us understand, is that a meaningful conversation to have, just simply deleting your app? And where does that get you and what does that mean for us?
Thanks, Sasha, and thanks so much to the organizers for having me. Look, I mean, the greatest security risk to people searching for abortion or needing abortion services is other people, right? It is whether it's someone who they have shared some information with in the process of searching for an abortion, or, and this is very real, a healthcare provider who they've turned to for services, for help. And the conversation about deleting your period trackers, about data privacy, we'll get into a lot of this, but it was fueled by many of the concerns that have just been laid out, many of them legitimate, about, what data we share with tech companies, with femtech companies, what they do with it, and who, including law enforcement, might have access to it. And yes, it is also true that people's digital health data have been used and brought into evidence in cases where people are criminalized for pregnancy-related outcomes, for reproductive health outcomes. And as many of the speakers touched on yesterday, that criminalization is not equitably distributed, right? It falls most heavily on people of color and the most marginalized communities. So what does that mean for the way in which we think about data? Well, to date, still, the precipitating factor for the use of digital data in any of these cases has always been someone reporting them to law enforcement, who then have the power to seize people's devices, phones, and look at their histories, et cetera. But the question about how data are stored and who has access to them and what tech companies are doing with the data that people share is very real and very legitimate. And it is not just about law enforcement. And so this is where I'm gonna log roll and talk about the app that I have worked on with our partners at Women Help Women. It's called Euki, E-U-K-I. It is free. It is available on both iTunes and the Google Play Store. And we did a lot of research in 2017 talking to people about what was missing from the femtech products on the market and what they would want from a different kind of femtech product. And what we heard was that people wanted something that was inclusive, that they could see themselves in, that was comprehensive, that covered a whole range of sexual and reproductive health topics, including abortion, and was also the same place where they could track what was going on with their bodies. And very critically, throughout all of our conversations with a really diverse range of ages and geographies and languages and racial backgrounds, we heard people say over and over again that they needed something they could trust and that they wanted to know that their data was secure and private. Mostly, I mean, we heard from a lot of adolescents that they didn't want to have to be concerned about their data being seen by their parent. We heard about potentially violent partners. We heard about a lot of data concerns. And so when we made Euki, we really centered privacy and security at the heart. There is no back end to Euki, so there's no data to be stored. Anything that a user enters into the phone to track your period is stored locally on the phone. And like the Signal app, you can wipe the data at any point. You can set regular data deletion features. I'll talk a little bit more about the evolution of Euki, I think, a little bit later. And if people have questions, happy to share, or you can just download it right now and start playing around. But it is really critical to say that, this was in 2017. People had these concerns right then, and it is possible to develop a tech product that serves people's needs that does not have data privacy concerns.
So I'll jump in a little bit, and I'm stealing Jenny's question from yesterday, which is, what is the perceived threat, what is the potential threat, and what is the observed threat? And I think this theme is coming up a lot here. But of course, immediately after Dobbs, there was this perceived threat of, oh my gosh, everybody's gonna find out about X, Y, or Z reproductive choice that I made or decision that I made by these femtech apps. That was the perceived threat. The observed threat is that's not how police who are already prosecuting this pre-Dobbs are getting access to the information. The examples, as Caitlin just said, are healthcare providers who suspect somebody or a friend who sends somebody in. And then police get access to a whole host of data from people's phones and social media accounts and things. But it's not yet a broad search that's happening. But I think that the potential threat is so huge for so many reasons. And this isn't just about period tracking apps. It's so much bigger than that for a number of different reasons. Our society is built on selling people's data. That is how businesses run. And while there are some great examples of companies who have privacy by design in mind, unless we radically change our data ecosystem and our monetary ecosystem in this country, companies will not actually care about your privacy because they are making money off of you. And guess what? Reproductive data is some of the most lucrative data because people change their buying habits when they get pregnant and when they have children. And so whether or not we're talking about abortion specifically, reproductive data is going to be exciting to advertisers. And so people and companies are going to keep on collecting it. And I don't just mean, have you had an abortion? Have you gotten pregnant? I mean, think about all of the data that we have talked about in this conference. Searching for hotel rooms, Googling what an abortion fund is, filling up, using your credit card at a gas station, putting an abortion clinic in your GPS, texting a friend, putting something in social media. You cannot actually control this. I have tried. I wrote an article in The Atlantic. If you're interested, I got pregnant. It was a wanted pregnancy. I am a health privacy nerd, so I just tried to keep my pregnancy hidden from advertisers, and I failed. And I got diaper ads the week we lost the baby. So these harms are potentially criminal, right? If somebody is targeted because of criminal activity or because of suspected criminal activity, but it goes so much more than that, in that we do not have reproductive health privacy in this world or in this country, and we will not have reproductive health justice until we have that privacy, and that requires actual data privacy, not just about reproductive health privacy, but about all of big data that is being collected about us.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what was said. I also want to talk about a threat that maybe we're not thinking about, right? Because we're thinking about all of the threats that have been mentioned today. Here's what I also think about whenever I think about these period tracking apps and femtech and the fear that surrounds them right now, is what happens if we as women are not putting data into an industry that's designed to revolutionize women's healthcare. So femtech evolved because so much of healthcare that we know today has originated from male physiology, and it's been applied to women with the understanding that we're just mini-men with different reproductive organs. That's not true, right? We've seen over and over how different types of prescriptions and medications and treatment plans impact women differently. And because of that, femtech has started to evolve to empower women and help us understand our own bodies, help medicine come into the 21st century with regards to women. Now we have this climate of fear. Now we have women turning away from period tracking apps. So we have less women giving data into these apps that are hopefully trying to create solutions to further women's healthcare and have female-specific understanding of these types of medications, these diseases, these illnesses, these treatments. what I think about is also how this plays out across different ethnicities and different types of races. Specifically, right, when we think about where abortion is happening, where it's being criminalized the hardest, we see that there are certain racial and ethnic minorities who are going to be more affected or more targeted by what's happening. Those are going to be the individuals who are going to have more and more fear about putting their data into these apps. Now, some of these apps work and have partnerships that are very beneficial with respect to clinical research. Clue is one of them that I think partners with other clinical researchers to use this data to help further women's healthcare research. If we're having less diverse data inputted into these applications with the research connection, that means that researchers aren't seeing the full spectrum of women's healthcare issues and women's healthcare data. And then we could get solutions that actually aren't inclusive for all of women. And so that's what also concerns me whenever we think about, yes, right, it's very easy to abandon our period tracking app. But if we abandon femtech industry as a whole, we could be setting women's healthcare back. And so that's why I think it's so important that we have and we demand privacy for our data so we can keep furthering this industry. Caitlin.
I just want to jump in to say, I mean, I think it's a technology problem broadly. I don't think, I mean, certainly in our research with Yuki, the people that we talked to did not see themselves represented in technology products, period. So there is a diversity issue, there is a representation issue. You know, we had people talking to us about not wanting predictive programming for their cycles because they might be taking hormones, or you know, they have an irregular cycle, or whatever reason. And, you know, we just kept hearing over and over that the femtech products that were on the market were made for cis white women who are trying to get pregnant. And they did not see themselves in those products, the people who we were talking to. And so I think just thinking about representation in technology broadly, like we don't have a representative sample of data going into femtech products now, and that, I mean, that's a huge issue.
Thank you. And let me invite Laura to chime in here, because we're started the conversation a little bit about the weaponization of data, the criminalization concerns, but you're touching on the fact that the data is what can also drive the innovation. It's the research we need from a public health perspective, right? And Laura, you described yourself to me the other day as a people counter, if I got that right, and which is perfect, a demographer. And so please chime in on what this is doing in terms of your sources of data, your collection, their methodology, how it's skewing things or not.
Sure. So I have a different voice on this panel. I want to be yes and here. Yes, I am concerned about data privacy, and I'm concerned about data availability to support research and policies. And I truly believe that we do not have enough data. We don't have high enough quality data, and our data tends to be biased. I firmly believe that you have to be counted to count in our society, and I think we just need to look to the LGBTQ movement and how the shift to implementing high quality measures and national surveys to understand the size and needs of that population has had an enormous difference in health and in values in our society. So we need to be counting people's experiences around abortion. I'm concerned that we're running the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which might be a strange term when we're thinking about abortion. But I want to try to balance this tension of privacy and confidentiality and risk with data needs. So I think we have two key research questions that are important for thinking about improving policy and care. And essentially they are, can we monitor and understand who is going to be getting abortions and who is not? And I think we have barely adequate data for that first question, and we have almost no data or mechanism for studying that second question, and that really concerns me. So let's think about, let me walk you through the Demography 101, where abortion data comes from. Essentially, we get data from three key places. So the first are surveys that actually ask women. We never ask men. These are surveys that are written based on gender identified when the interviewer comes to you. We ask them to report their pregnancy and specifically abortion experiences. About half of abortions aren't reported by women when asked in these kinds of surveys. No surprise, abortion is stigmatized, in our society, and stigma is driving much of this. With national surveys that don't adequately measure abortion, that is not just a problem for understanding abortion, it's a problem for understanding abortion in the context of people's broader lives, because that's where you have this richer set of life course and personal measures. And it's a problem for understanding pregnancy. You cannot study pregnancy if you haven't measured abortion. We should be caring about abortion measurement, not just for the 14 researchers in this country who study abortion, but the thousands who care about a range of pregnancy and health issues. This is about interpregnancy intervals, infant health, infertility, and we don't have those very basic measures here. And as an example of this, the federal government has not produced a pregnancy rate in more than a decade. We rely, and this is where our next set of data comes from, is when we collect abortion counts from clinicians to trusted research endeavors. The main endeavor that's been going on for decades is the Guttmacher Institute counts, but We Count from SFP is another example of using the faith and trust of that organization to ask clinicians to report accurately. The third place, which also relies on clinician reports, are reports to state departments of health, and then those are ramped up to federal data. So the federal government itself doesn't go to clinicians, but the states, most states require clinicians to report some pieces of information about abortion. We could call that tracking, we could call that surveillance, there's a range of words to use for that. But the reality is that when we look at the data, it's clear that clinicians don't trust their state departments of health, are likely concerned about this data being weaponized, and they don't fully report. So the Guttmacher counts historically have been the most complete counts of abortion that we have. Well, when the federal government decided that they wanted to stop using the Guttmacher counts, for political reasons, they therefore couldn't create a high-quality pregnancy rate. So we now rely on the Guttmacher Institute to give us a national, not just a national abortion rate, but a national pregnancy rate. That's one private group, essentially with one private funder, and one dear friend of mine who does this, providing necessary data for our whole country for so much more than just abortion. We could improve all of our measurement. I think it's a question of politics and priorities. In the same way that HHS and CDC has brought in panels of experts to work on improving measurement of income, to work on improving measurement of LGBTQ identity. Where is the panel and consortium on improving measurement of abortion? I definitely should not be the only one. And we've known for decades that these surveys of individual women are underreported. So we just need more momentum on this. But let's think of some of the challenges moving forward. So if you couldn't get women to tell you about their abortions at a time when it was legal in all 50 states to varying degrees, imagine what's going to happen when we now show up at women's doors and ask them to tell us, and they're not, either they know it's illegal in their state, or as we're seeing from some of these studies, they're not quite sure. We think reporting is going to go down. So that source of data, I think, is going to be really problematic. I think we're also entering even more of a national narrative where the distinction between abortion and miscarriage and pregnancy loss is getting into not a shared definition. And what does that do to our measures? And then both reporting to trusted organizations and reporting to DOH by providers is going to be more challenging. It's going to be more challenging because of a lack of trust. It's going to be more challenging because of, I think, changes in the abortion provider landscape. How do you get data from the telehealth-only providers? Are they going to do it? The demands on clinics, you're a surge clinic. Do you really have time to be filling this out when Guttmacher calls you? And the details, information that they want? Maybe not. We know that different departments of health are discussing changing their reporting regulations. This is obviously a mixed bag, but certainly some states are talking about requiring less reporting because they're concerned about the confidentiality and paperwork trail. around this. Two things that we get from state departments that no one else gets is race, ethnicity of patients and traveling across state lines. And we use that data even when we know it's incomplete and biased. My state of New Jersey is the worst reporter in the country for a variety of reasons that are actually they're policy reasons. They don't require everyone to report. But if you want to know who traveled in or out of New Jersey, you're basing it off of less than 50% of the abortions. And California doesn't have state reporting at all, and that's part of why these national numbers are so wrong. And then I think we just need to, I mean, in general, I'm calling for, we want to do data. We need data. But I think we need to interrogate our methods and approaches. I think we need to identify the minimal data elements that we need and not just keep asking, because isn't it cool to have, I mean, yes, it's cool to have data, but we need to respect the people whose data this is and not ask them for more than we need, can use, or treat safely. And we need to just generally, I think more about how we're going to study people whose barriers to getting an abortion were so great that they're not at the clinic, because no provider can then tell you about them, and no survey of patients in waiting rooms has their experiences. And they're in our national surveys, but the rest of the data is such a mess. What do you do with it? You can't tell if someone didn't have an abortion or isn't telling you about their abortion, and that makes this kind of work very hard.
Can I ask you a question, Laura,
Sure.
about that? You just talked about the big selection bias issue that we have in abortion data broadly, and as we are now thinking about so many states where abortion has been banned and concerns about reporting, how do we as researchers help participants in our studies trust us with their data? I mean, we just talked about femtech companies, but as researchers, what do we do?
So we could spend a day on IRB, and I would love a mixed public health law meeting on our, yes, Jenny, you know, I'm looking at you, Jenny. Because this is where we get into IRBs trying to protect human subject risk and institutional risk. And sometimes we amp up too much on the institutional risk, and then we consent them, and you build a consent form that is so big that it's terrifying. So again, what is the minimal interaction we need to have to get that data? And I want that to be protective of human subjects, but it shouldn't be 4 pages of consenting in, because I think that increases this anxiety. We can be talking more explicitly, I think, about how we store data. We should be storing our data in Canada. There is no reason to, NIH has said there is no reason, they do not know, so therefore there's no reason to believe that certificates of confidentiality for research that US researchers can get for their data will hold if subpoenaed. This used to be stuff that came up, I mean, decades ago, I worked on a national survey of men, and we got certificates of confidentiality because we were concerned that this would end up in child support proceedings. Right? You know your ex-partner participated in this survey, and now you want to know, is he paying someone else child support that he's not paying you? Did he have another kid that he reported? Now we're going to have this around abortion. So it's not just that we need a locked door, a locked drawer in our file cabinet. I don't even think it's that we need password-protected files in our university system. I think we need to be building better infrastructure, and if we could systematize that as a community, and be able to point to, this is how your data is going to be stored, this is the data protections, this is what we will and won't do with it, again, without a 4-page consent form, that might help. And then it's the piece that we've been talking about throughout this, which is community engagement, community participation, not only trying to understand people's lived experiences, but have people with those experiences from the community as the face and engagement of some of our research projects. So it's a partnership that isn't just you people from academia coming in wanting to probe your lights in my nether regions. Yeah.
Well, and let me just take a small shift here to kind of circle back to some topics we touched on about who are the most vulnerable. And Kate, I'd love if you could chime in here because of the work you do understanding within the criminal justice system and women in the criminal justice system and how they're at the most sort of risk here when it comes to these topics.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here and to learn from these amazing panelists. I've been learning a lot. So yeah, I'm a criminal defense lawyer by training, and I teach criminal law. And I have to say, I think that for the sort of area that I'm most interested in is people who are on some form of court supervision, so pretrial release, probation, and parole, but not just people who are on that, but also people subject to the welfare system, the child welfare system, family court. Everyone who is involved in those systems are so much more vulnerable. Their data has been used extensively and taken advantage of extensively before Dobbs and will only intensify post-Dobbs. So just take, for example, someone who's on court supervision, say probation, they might be put on an ankle monitor that tracks their location at all times. Their cell phone might be subject to search at all times without a warrant. Some of these monitors are equipped with two-way microphones. And also, they're subject to travel bans. HIPAA often doesn't apply because part of agreeing to be agreeing, and I say that in quotes very deliberately, part of agreeing to be on a monitor, for that matter, agreeing to get benefits from the government involves sharing your medical information and sort of waiving any privacy protection you have. I just remember routinely having clients just signing away saying, of course, the court, probation departments, police can access my medical records and my mental health records as part of being subject to court supervision. And so in some ways, there's a perfect digital trail for people who are subject to, again, not just the criminal court system, but other sort of public welfare institutions to investigate illegal abortions and to investigate, of course, other aspects of reproductive health. And I think that will only, that's always been the case and will intensify. I will say too, I mean, it's not that hard for police to get warrants. I think we think of the warrant requirement as this great protection, but of course it isn't, nor too is it particularly hard for police and prosecutors to get subpoenas. I mean, so I think that that's also really important to keep in mind and echoes much of what my co-panelists have said. And I do think, to the extent that we're thinking through what does privacy protection look like post-Dobbs, what does federal legislation and state legislation look like, I think too often it's focused on this sort of monolith that everyone's privacy is the same. And of course, that's just not true. And the families that I worked with, at least, are sort of routinely excluded from a lot of the really great privacy protection legislation. So for example, the National Privacy Protection, Data Privacy Protection Law that's now stalled in Congress explicitly takes out any government agency. So that basically doesn't apply to police, to probation departments, to criminal courts. And so I think that thinking through these sort of legislative fixes to data protection requires thinking about what that means for people who are differently exposed to surveillance.
So I want to jump in here on just setting the ground a little bit of privacy law. Bethany did a great job of distinguishing between HIPAA, right, information that comes from within the medical realm that is protected by HIPAA privacy, and then everything else, which for the most part is just not protected. There are some state level regulations that are adding broader privacy laws. There was a national bill in last Congress that made it the furthest that ever made it, and by that I mean it got voted out or got voted in a committee, out of a committee, but wasn't actually voted on fully. But as Kate was mentioning, a lot of these privacy rules accept each other, right? So the state level privacy laws, the data privacy laws, often exclude HIPAA protected information. And HIPAA allows for sharing with law enforcement when there's a warrant or subpoena. And so even within the medical realm, that's not completely protective. And one of the exceptions to HIPAA is people waiving their rights, which sometimes is voluntary and sometimes is a voluntary waiver of that right? And then the same for research. We have protections and these certificates of confidentiality, which are certificates that the NIH, when they fund research, give out that say, this is confidential and cannot be or this information won't be given out in a subpoena or warrant, but there's also research showing that courts aren't necessarily abiding by these certificates of confidentiality. So I just want to say all that to say people don't really understand what's protected and what's not. People think HIPAA does way more than it does. And so it's not, I don't want us to leave this panel thinking, oh, well, whatever's in the medical realm is fine and whatever's not is not fine. It's all sort of not fine. And on the vulnerability question, I think one of the things that is really important, along with what you were saying, is to the extent that people can protect their privacy, it's a privilege as well. iPhones, for example, Apple tends to have more encryption and more things than other phones. Well, guess what? They're more expensive. If you want a virtual VPN, whatever VPN stands for that I'm forgetting right now. If you want that to stop a tracker, that often can cost money. There's like Yuki is free, that's awesome, but there are also some more privacy by design apps that cost money because guess what? They're not selling your data, and so they're not making it that way, so they have to make their money otherwise. So we also compounded with all of the systemic problems that we've been talking about, privacy also is a luxury that is more accessible for people with resources and not those at lower socioeconomic status.
Well, building off your comments about HIPAA in particular, and also building actually on the morning panel, right, where we talked about the self-managed abortion, sometimes we call it medication abortion, talking about the role of the provider as gatekeeper. Is abortion even medical care, or should it be framed that way? Of course, we just talked about HIPAA having huge gaps in terms of what protection actually affords. Take us a little bit through some of, or anyone, if they will chime in, on the implications of the decision coming out of Texas in terms of from the privacy data perspective. And we'll get close to wrapping up there with our Q&A coming up.
I mean, I'll just start by saying, if you Google, how do I access one of these, I mean, there's a lot of great resources out there that people, I'm sorry, I forgot Melissa's point earlier. We need to get that information out there, but if you type in a search term that's trying to get yourself connected with that information, that itself is something that is a search that can and has been used in previous court cases as evidence before. Now, also to Melissa's point, does that mean people shouldn't search for this? No, it just means that there's a risk involved with building that data trail. And how do you then tell people that that's part of the legal risk, I think is a challenge. One thing we haven't talked about, but it's also, this came up yesterday, most of the laws right now aren't targeted towards the person who is pregnant or terminating the pregnancy, it's targeted towards the providers and helpers. And the lack of privacy makes them just as vulnerable, if not more so, for helping somebody gain access to this. And those might be risks that they're willing to take on, but this privacy piece does impact that as well.
I just want to bring attention to the other Texas court case, which determined that Title X contraceptive care does not need to be confidential for teens, which breaks completely with Title X mandates. And I want to raise that up to say that adolescents, and particularly minors, have historically and continually had the least right to privacy in their sexual and reproductive health care of essentially any group in this country. And this isn't just about how their data is collected and stored. This is literally about their ability to consent without involving a parent to contraceptive care, abortion care, and I think we've spoken about teens very little here, and I think we really need to start raising them up and centering their needs. What is good for teens will help women of all ages as we think about what access and privacy and rights looks like.
Yeah, I think thinking about marginalized and vulnerable populations is a really important frame when we think about, just access to information and what technology can do. Technology is not a panacea, and it is not accessible to everyone, and it is not the right solution for everyone. And just going back to the panel we had just before ours, the internet has really expanded access, especially to medication abortion, but it is not a silver bullet. And there are many people for whom accessing pills through the internet is not going to be a viable solution for a number of different reasons. And so I do think it is really critical to center the experiences of communities who have been doing this work for centuries, caring for each other, and do hold information and making sure that they have both information and supplies to be able to support the people in their communities for whom accessing the internet and sharing their data isn't the right decision.
So just as we're wrapping up before we get to questions, just on a positive forward-looking note, we'll start with Bethany maybe. You know, tell us a little bit about the industry perspective. How are femtech companies responding? Just what are the solutions that are helping to manage some of these risks and concerns? And we'll hear from a couple folks if we can, and then let's please get ready for questions.
Absolutely. So there has been growth and transformation in the femtech industry since the Dobbs decision has come out. There are a lot of really good companies out there who want to do right by their consumers and the women and protect those who are using their applications. There's also been, for reproductive health companies that are in this space who may not be doing abortion. For instance, there might be a fertility company. They're thinking through, okay, what if somebody mentions an abortion when they're talking to a coach on my app? What should I be doing, even though I'm not providing abortion, right? Even though I'm not going to be at risk. They're actually taking proactive steps to talk to their community members and those who are using their applications and say, hey, you entered this data. I just want you to know, here are the potential consequences. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to protect it. I've also started to see for femtech applications, those who are coming new to the market, putting privacy by design and privacy-centric applications and technology into place, starting to build with that consumer-centric mentality. One of the other things I've started to see is some applications are revamping their privacy policies, not only to give consumers more choices, but to make them more transparent and understandable, because nobody understands a 20-page privacy policy. We don't read it. It takes years off your life if you read all of them. I can't remember, it's like 7 years to read all these things. I'm an attorney, I don't read them, right? And so we're not enhancing consumer choice and meaningful, choices and decisions with those long, lengthy privacy policies. And so I've started to see a little bit of movement on the femtech side to really trying to make this understandable for their consumers, highlighting in emails and other types of communications, hey, if you mention abortion data, here's what we're gonna do, and just trying to educate consumers as well about their rights.
So Anya mentioned earlier that our entire society is basically based on the selling of data. So without saying that we should abolish capitalism as the solution to all of this, I do think that listening to users and people who, will and have to share their data for a lot of different reasons about what matters to them in the development of things like privacy policies or industry standards or legislation around data and data privacy is going to be critical, because people are the experts in their own lives. They know what they need, and they can be very clear about it if the people who are developing technologies or policies will listen.
All right. Kate, you want to have the last word before the questions? Thank you.
Sure. No, I think also just voting rights and elections matter. I mean, if we think about criminalization and sort of the ways in which, like I was saying, how easy it is for police to get this data and for prosecutors to get this data. I mean, so many prosecutors are elected, judges are elected, and those elections really matter, because we can now see that there are prosecutors coming forward saying, I'm not going to be prosecuting these cases. And that's what's going to stop, to some degree, some of the criminalization and the use of data, is just brave prosecutors saying, I'm not going to bring these cases. So those elections matter.
Thank you. Who's got the mic for the first question? Or okay, I see a hand here. Maybe if we can make it down there. Thank you. I thought maybe the mic was already passed. Well, we have just 5 amazing panelists, so I want to make sure we get to hear from them, but also get your great questions. Caitlin, right? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Caitlin Myers. I'm an economist. This was awesome. Thanks, y'all. And I have both a very short story that ties into a question that maybe Anya could start with. So as Laura was saying, it's really hard to count abortions, and most of my research is devoted to using statistical methods to try to count them. And one of the sources that Laura didn't mention is data from location data brokers. In fact, they haven't really come up specifically. So if you have a phone with you, various entities know where you are right now. They also know where you sleep. And depending on how you have your privacy settings, like lots of entities, like right now, I suspect that Starbucks, McDonald's, The Gap, Amazon, Google, and Apple all know where I am. And they, depends on which app it is, but they sell these data to location data brokers. And I was on a project a while ago where we were buying the data from location data brokers to count people showing up at abortion clinics. And you know where they live, you know they're going to the abortion clinic. I got very freaked out and stepped off of the project publicly. It was like reported on that I was very freaked out. But the other economists on the project still did it. There's multiple papers. And what I saw in that data, like my kind of worst case scenario is not about the government, it's not about femtech. It's about a vigilante just hacking the data. There are multiple location data brokers. Their job is not to keep the data safe. And even companies whose jobs is to keep data safe, like Equifax, get hacked, right? My fear is a vigilante hacks them and just publishes, here's a list of everybody from Texas who showed up at an abortion facility in Kansas. Can you make me feel better? I know you wanted to end on a happy note.
From positive back to dire. Let's go back to positive.
Yeah, I didn't speak up on the positive question. Yeah, location data is a huge issue. There are studies of people buying this for like $150, buying access to this location data for free. Or handing it out for free. And there have been some instances, not so much of posting this online, but in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Attorney General investigated a group that was putting a geofence around abortion clinics and sending advertisements to people that went into there. That was basically anti-abortion advertisements saying, are you sure you want to do this? Don't do this to a child, right? And you would get these advertisements for some period of time after you stepped foot into a clinic, presumably whether or not you were there for cancer screening or for an abortion or worked there or whatever the case, or took a friend there. And so location data is a big problem. I guess I would say on a hopeful note, there is more attention to this. So there were some efforts in Congress to have hearings about this, to talk to data brokers about what they should do. So for example, Google said, well, we'll stop tracking sensitive or location data about sensitive locations. That's my positive note. My downside is, guess what? If you have a gap in your data that shows you all around it, and then all of a sudden you disappear off the face of the location Earth for a little while, smart data analysts can put together that you were probably at an abortion clinic. And so again, I go back to, I'm going to get rid of capitalism. I mean, we have to change the system or it's not going to change. And there are models out there of having more privacy, like minimalist data collection, rules about how data brokers can use this, and rules about inferring sensitive information from generalized information.
Can I just piggyback? I mean, the other thing too is, you know, the people who are ordered to wear ankle monitors, of which there's millions at this point, both in the immigration system and the criminal justice system, that data is routinely, I mean, that's not protected at all and routinely shared and tracked. I mean, you don't need any, I mean, it's very easy to get that data. So it's sort of the problem that you just described, but sort of on steroids to some degree. And so, you know, when I saw the news about Google, it was like, well, that's great for like Google and for those of us who would be protected, but there's so many people who that would not matter to at all.
Yeah, and to make it even worse, sorry, what also concerns me, right? Yeah, we have the data broker issue. We also have cybersecurity in general, right? So we have all of these healthcare providers who have sensitive reproductive health data. And we think about the value of a health record on the black market, it's like $250, right? And put that in perspective, your financial credit card data on the black market's like $5.50, right? So you can't change your health data. So now we have not only health data itself being highly valued, we've got reproductive health data, which has just kind of skyrocketed in value given the Dobbs decision. And we have, to be honest, right, a lot of healthcare providers and healthcare organizations during COVID going to telehealth very quickly, not necessarily implementing the security and privacy, protections that they need. There could be instances in which cyber hackers now are trying to get reproductive health data at a higher frequency against systems that are not well protected. So that's what also concerns me.
Well, we'll go to the next question, gentleman in the green, and we see clearly that cybersecurity, the threat is greatest in healthcare. The statistics are just been out there for a decade because of the value of that data. Sorry, you're.
So Laura, yeah, there we go. Laura, I've got a question for you because there are a couple things you sort of said because of politics. So I'd love to hear more about the politics. You said 10 years ago, the federal government stopped using Guttmacher's statistics in calculating various things. So I'd love to hear more about that and why pro-choice administrations haven't gone back to that. And then two, sort of the flip side, why New Jersey and California are so bad at collecting abortion data. I understand because of some privacy concerns, but what are they really concerned about when we have 47 or 40 other states that do it and, to the best of my knowledge, has not compromised privacy by collecting that data? So what's going on in those states that we have such incomplete data?
Well, I think I want to challenge the assumption that it hasn't led to problems or doesn't pose the risk. And if you look at the range of data that's being collected across states, it's very varied, and in some states, very detailed and specific. And they're really items that are being measured to showcase the perils of abortion and the slutty women who go to get them, essentially. The states with the states with the most comprehensive reporting are exactly the states who now have outlawed all abortion, because they built this system. Their politics were to monitor with this weaponization of it. And we've seen some new bills just recently trying to frame it as public health and providing information, but really using the arm of the government to collect detailed information about people's intimate lives. That do we need it for a public health purpose? So there's lots of things public health departments can do to support health around abortion. The role of this kind of surveillance in that, I don't think we have a clear agreement on. I don't have the answer for why, like the Biden HHS isn't now calculating pregnancy rates, other than change is slow and hard. But it was always the case historically that when CDC calculated pregnancy rates, they didn't even use their own abortion data because they knew it was missing so much, and they turned to Guttmacher's. And then it was never articulated, but the implication was Guttmacher's too politicized, they come with an agenda, we don't want to use it, which is funny because even like the Lozier Institute says Guttmacher's data is better than the federal government's. So there were some efforts that are like complicated. They wanted to run statistical models where they could estimate it using existing data, but to do that, what the input they were feeding in were old Guttmacher estimates. So it was just this circular thing. I mean, it's an interesting econometric problem of how do you do an estimation, but that's not the political issue. And then there's a whole misreporting problem as well, that the government just turns a blind eye to, and we just don't know. But I think it's this issue of potential weaponization of the data that's being collected at the state. So California has, across a whole bunch of stuff, doesn't participate in federal data collection efforts, right? They don't do a PRAMS in the same way. There's lots of things they do themselves. They seem to have opted out. The other two states that don't collect anything at all are New Hampshire and Delaware. I'm not sure what the background on that is. And New Jersey has decided that only larger facilities, if these ambulatory care facilities need to be, and hospitals, and other providers don't. But New Jersey, I mean, I have these graphs. I mean, New Jersey is really off the chart. And I mean that in like the nicest way. But my estimate is that if the federal, which are really against state aggregated counts, were 2/3 of the abortion counts pre-Dobbs. They're going to be about 50% post-Dobbs because of what states now are doing zero, and what that means about who's collecting, and the fact that they don't collect as well. And some of it is just about the carrot and the stick of that process. So what state uses its stick? Well, New York doesn't beat up its providers when they don't fill out every form completely for this. They're not as concerned about that, where in Mississippi may be. And that may be why there's more complete reporting in those states.
So I'm charged with ensuring we end on time and stay on schedule. So with that, please join me in thanking these terrific panelists.
Another wonderful panel, even if it is depressing to think about the state of the world. So we are now breaking for lunch. For the attendees, we have lunch outside there, and you are welcome to walk and sit anywhere in the hallway. There are lots of tables and chairs to sit in. For the panelists and the moderators, we have lunch at the end of the hall, which is the Tasher Great Room. We are coming back at 12:35 for our keynote with Jennifer Reich. So you've got about 55 minutes or 50 minutes for lunch.
Yeah.